what really happened when a disciple disobeyed the ancient Druids, and why stepping into the sacred grove could already mean you were condemned before a single word was spoken. Imagine entering a forest where silence was not peace, but surveillance. In the popular imagination, Druids are wise philosophers of nature, gentle guardians of balance, whispering truths beneath oak trees. But beneath that image existed a far darker reality. Within the sacred groves, obedience was not optional. It was survival. The moment a disciple questioned a teaching, hesitated during a ritual, or failed to submit completely, the grove itself became a courtroom. No public accusation, no defense, only watchful eyes, memorized gestures, and a hierarchy that never needed to raise its voice. Disobedience among the Druids was not treated as a mistake. It was framed as a rupture in the natural order, a spiritual infection, a threat to cosmic balance. The language mattered. When authority redefines doubt as danger, punishment becomes sacred duty. Disciples learned early that the worst thing you could do was stand out. Curiosity, independence, or moral hesitation were quietly noted, observed during rituals, whispered about during walks through the forest. Judgment began long before any confrontation. The grove itself played a role. Sacred spaces were deliberately isolated, circular, enclosed by ancient trees that blocked the outside world. This physical separation reinforced psychological control. Once inside, the disciple was no longer an individual, but a vessel, a body meant to receive, obey, and disappear into tradition. The Druids taught that the forest remembered everything, that nature itself witnessed disobedience. This belief turned fear inward. You were never alone. Even your thoughts felt exposed. What makes this system terrifying is how clean it appeared. There were no chains, no visible prisons. Control operated through ritual precision, symbolic authority, and the constant reminder that knowledge itself was a privilege that could be revoked. To be expelled from the grove was not just exile, it meant spiritual death, loss of identity, loss of protection, loss of meaning in a world where the sacred defined reality. Many disciples complied not because they believed, but because resistance felt unthinkable. The punishment was rarely described openly. Instead, stories circulated in fragments, a name never mentioned again, a place in the ritual circle suddenly empty. A former initiate referred to only in warnings. Silence was the message. Silence was the threat. And this is where the true horror begins. When punishment is hidden, imagination becomes more powerful than violence itself. The grove did not need to explain what happened to the disobedient. It only needed to ensure that everyone feared discovering it firsthand. Because once the Druids decided someone had crossed an invisible line, the next steps were already prepared, precise, ritualized, and justified as necessary for balance. If this story unsettled you, that reaction is important. These were not isolated myths or exaggerated legends. They were real systems of power, belief, and control that shaped lives, erased voices, and punished disobedience in the name of the sacred. Understanding what the ancient Druids really did to disobedient disciples is not about attacking spirituality. It is about exposing how spiritual authority can be weaponized when it becomes untouchable. If you believe history should be examined honestly, without romantic filters, leave a comment sharing what shocked you the most so far. Your perspective helps keep these hidden stories alive. If this kind of deep, researched, and immersive historical storytelling matters to you, give this video a like so more people can encounter the truth behind the myths. And if you want to continue uncovering the horrors that ancient cults and temples tried to hide, subscribe to the channel. This is only the beginning. What most people never realize is that the Druids did not rely on punishment alone. Long before any ritual correction, there was something far more effective: constant observation. To be a disciple inside the grove meant living under a form of spiritual surveillance so subtle that it reshaped behavior without force. Every movement, every hesitation, every question was silently evaluated. Learning was never neutral. It was a test. Disciples were taught that knowledge flowed downward, never sideways. Questions were allowed only if they reinforced doctrine. Curiosity that drifted beyond accepted boundaries was marked as imbalance. The Druids framed this vigilance as care, as guidance, as protection of sacred harmony. But in practice, it created an environment where self-censorship became instinct. You learned not to ask. You learned not to wonder. You learned to watch yourself before anyone else did. This system relied heavily on peer observation. Older initiates monitored younger ones. Ritual assistants reported subtle deviations. Silence itself became a signal. A disciple who spoke less, who hesitated during chants, or who avoided eye contact during ceremonies drew attention. Nothing dramatic happened at first. That was the point. Control worked best when it felt invisible, when fear lived inside the disciple rather than being imposed from above. Women and younger initiates were especially vulnerable. They occupied ambiguous spiritual positions, often praised for sensitivity and intuition, yet punished harshly for the same traits when they challenged authority. Emotional responses were framed as weakness. Independent interpretations of symbols were labeled dangerous. Over time, disciples internalized the belief that obedience was the highest form of spiritual maturity. The Grove reinforced this through ritual repetition. Circular gatherings ensured everyone was visible. Sacred tools were passed in prescribed sequences, making deviation instantly noticeable. Even breathing patterns during chants were regulated. These details were not accidental. They trained the body to submit before the mind could resist. Discipline was embodied, not debated. What makes this system deeply disturbing is how it erased the line between faith and fear. Disciples did not feel oppressed in the conventional sense. They felt responsible for maintaining balance, responsible for not corrupting the sacred order, responsible for their own punishment if they failed. When authority convinces you that suffering is self-inflicted, rebellion collapses before it begins. And yet, despite all this control, disobedience never disappeared. It only became quieter, hidden in glances, in delayed responses, in private doubts whispered to the forest itself. These subtle fractures terrified the Druids more than open rebellion ever could. Because once doubt survives surveillance, the system must escalate. Observation alone is no longer enough. And when that happens, discipline transforms into something far darker, ritualized, and irreversible. At some point, doubt stopped being tolerated and started being criminalized. Inside the Druidic system, disobedience was not framed as human error or intellectual disagreement. It was transformed into a spiritual offense, a violation not against leaders, but against nature itself. This shift was crucial. Once resistance is defined as cosmic disorder, punishment no longer feels like cruelty. It feels necessary. The Druids carefully constructed this logic. A disciple who questioned a ritual was no longer just questioning tradition. They were accused of disturbing balance, weakening the bond between the grove and the unseen forces it claimed to channel. Language did the heavy work. Words like impurity, imbalance, and corruption replaced doubt, fear, or confusion. This reframing allowed violence to wear the mask of preservation. What made this especially effective was how responsibility was inverted. The accused was told that whatever followed was not imposed by the Druids, but demanded by the natural order. The forest required correction. The spirits demanded restoration. Authority disappeared behind symbolism. When power hides itself inside ritual, there is no one left to appeal to. Public confrontation was rare. Instead, disobedience was addressed through private summons, subtle exclusions from ceremonies, or sudden changes in how others treated the accused. A disciple might notice they were no longer invited to certain rites, their role in chants quietly removed, their presence tolerated but no longer trusted. This social limbo was intentional. It isolated without spectacle, breaking resistance slowly. For women, this process was faster and more brutal. Traits once praised as spiritual sensitivity were quickly reclassified as instability or dangerous intuition. A woman who interpreted signs differently, who spoke too confidently, or who hesitated to submit could be accused of channeling forces outside the accepted order. Disobedience became contamination, and contamination demanded cleansing. The most terrifying part is that there was no clear line, no written rulebook, no explicit list of forbidden thoughts. This ambiguity kept everyone anxious. If rules are invisible, everyone is guilty. Disciples learned to scan their own behavior constantly, fearing that a single misstep could retroactively become evidence of corruption. And when the accusation finally came, it often felt inevitable, as if the system had been watching all along, waiting for the moment when doubt accumulated enough weight to justify action. By then, resistance was already weakened. The disciple had been isolated, destabilized, and conditioned to believe they deserved correction. This is the moment where control crosses into ritualized punishment, where correction becomes ceremony, where discipline stops pretending to be guidance and reveals its true purpose. Because once disobedience is defined as a sacred crime, the next step is not debate. It is ritual, and ritual does not ask permission. Once disobedience was declared a spiritual crime, the process moved away from words and into ceremony. What followed was never called punishment. It was described as correction, realignment, restoration of balance. This language mattered because it allowed cruelty to exist without being named. Inside the grove, violence did not appear sudden or chaotic. It unfolded, slowly, wrapped in ritual precision, symbolism, and silence. These disciplinary rites were deliberately hidden from the broader community. They took place at night, or in deeper sections of the forest reserved for higher initiates. Isolation was the first step. The accused was removed from familiar spaces, stripped of routine, and separated from those who might offer emotional grounding. Silence was enforced. Questions were forbidden. Even fear had to be contained. The disciple was taught that resistance would only worsen the imbalance they were accused of creating. Humiliation played a central role. Clothing, symbols, or ritual markings once earned through obedience could be removed publicly before a small inner circle. This reversal of status was devastating. Identity within the grove was everything. To lose it meant becoming nothing. The body itself became part of the ceremony. Kneeling, fasting, prolonged exposure to cold or darkness, forced stillness. These were not random acts. They were designed to exhaust the mind and break the will without leaving visible scars. Women experienced these rites with particular intensity. Their bodies were treated as unstable vessels, needing stricter control. Acts framed as purification often crossed into abuse, disguised as spiritual necessity. Touch, restraint, and exposure were justified through symbolism. The accused was told their suffering was not inflicted, but revealed. That pain was proof of imbalance leaving the body. What made these rituals especially effective was their unpredictability. There was no set duration, no clear end. The disciple never knew when the correction would be deemed sufficient. This uncertainty destroyed any remaining sense of agency. Time itself became a weapon. Every moment of endurance was presented as a test of submission, while failure was framed as further evidence of corruption. Observers played a role too. Senior Druids and selected initiates were present not to intervene, but to witness. Their silence reinforced legitimacy. No one spoke because speaking would align them with disobedience. Fear spread horizontally, not just downward. Everyone learned what compliance looked like by watching what happened when someone failed. And when the ritual ended, there was no closure, no explanation. The disciple returned changed, diminished, or not at all. Those who came back were expected to resume life as if nothing had happened, carrying the weight of unspoken terror. Those who did not return became warnings without stories, because the grove did not need to describe its punishments. It relied on absence, rumor, and imagination, and once discipline became ritualized, it no longer required justification. At a certain point, discipline stopped being about correction and started becoming theater. Inside the Druidic system, punishment was carefully transformed into a message, designed not only for the accused, but for everyone who remained. These acts were never spontaneous. They were calculated, timed, and framed to be remembered. Fear was not a side effect. It was the objective. Some rituals were made deliberately visible, but only partially. Disciples might be summoned to the edge of a clearing, instructed to remain silent, and forced to witness fragments of what was happening deeper within the grove. Shadows moving between trees, chants carried by the wind, a scream cut short. The lack of clarity was intentional. When the mind fills in the gaps, terror becomes personal. Everyone imagines a different horror, and all of them feel real. The Druids understood that a single severe example could replace dozens of minor punishments. A disciple who endured visible suffering became a living symbol, not of resilience, but of consequence. Those who returned from these rituals were changed in ways that could not be hidden. Their posture, their silence, their avoidance of eye contact all communicated the same message. Do not cross the line. Do not ask where the line is. Women were often used as these warnings more aggressively. Their punishment carried layered symbolism. A woman who had spoken too freely or challenged interpretation was reframed as chaos made flesh. Her correction was presented as restoration of order. The message to others was clear. Spiritual ambition without submission would not be tolerated. Visibility itself became dangerous. What made this system especially powerful was how it removed the need for constant enforcement. Once fear was embedded, obedience became automatic. Disciples disciplined themselves. They warned each other. They repeated official explanations without being asked. Authority no longer needed to watch closely. The grove watched itself. Even compassion was manipulated. Disciples were encouraged to feel sorrow for the punished, but never solidarity. Sympathy was allowed only if it did not challenge legitimacy. Grief was redirected into acceptance. This emotional redirection prevented collective resistance from forming. Everyone suffered alone, believing they were the only one who felt disturbed. Over time, the warning rituals became part of the grove's unspoken curriculum. New initiates learned not through instruction, but through absence. Someone who should have been there was gone, their role reassigned, their name avoided, questions unanswered. Silence again did the work. And this is how punishment completed its transformation. It no longer needed to be frequent. It only needed to be remembered. The fear lingered long after the ritual ended, shaping behavior, thought, and belief. But fear alone is unstable. To sustain control across generations, the Druids needed something more permanent, something structural, something that ensured power remained concentrated at the top. And that is where the hierarchy revealed its true purpose. Behind every ritual, every warning, and every act of silent punishment stood a rigid hierarchy designed to protect authority above all else. The Druidic system did not function as a loose gathering of spiritual equals. It was a vertical structure, carefully layered, where knowledge and power flowed in one direction only. Senior Druids occupied a position that was never meant to be questioned, and that immunity was the foundation of abuse. At the top of this hierarchy, interpretation became control. Senior Druids alone claimed the right to define what nature demanded, what the spirits signaled, and what balance required. Their words were not opinions. They were presented as translations of cosmic will. This made disagreement impossible. To challenge a senior Druid was not to challenge a man, but to challenge the forest, the ancestors, and the invisible forces governing reality itself. This concentration of authority created a dangerous environment. Personal ambition, rivalry, fear of losing status, and political maneuvering were all disguised as spiritual necessity. Decisions that benefited the hierarchy were justified as protection of tradition. Eliminating a troublesome disciple could be reframed as preserving harmony. Silencing a woman who inspired others could be explained as preventing spiritual contamination. Senior Druids rarely carried out punishments themselves. Distance was essential. Orders were transmitted through layers of ritual language and delegated roles, allowing those at the top to remain symbolically pure. Responsibility was dispersed, but accountability vanished. No one could point to a single decision-maker because every action was said to originate beyond human will. This structure also ensured loyalty through complicity. Lower-ranking initiates were drawn into enforcement roles, witnessing or assisting in disciplinary rites. Once involved, silence became self-preservation. To speak out would mean admitting participation in something forbidden to name. Guilt bound the hierarchy together as effectively as belief. Women were particularly vulnerable within this system because their advancement depended entirely on approval from above. Any form of influence outside sanctioned channels was perceived as a threat. A respected female disciple could destabilize authority simply by being listened to. Senior Druids responded to this not with debate, but with removal. The hierarchy could not allow alternative centers of trust to exist. What makes this abuse especially insidious is that it did not rely on constant cruelty. It relied on structure, on rituals that normalized obedience, on ranks that rewarded compliance, on silence that protected those who benefited most. Power became invisible, untouchable, and eternal. And once a hierarchy learns it can eliminate resistance without consequence, escalation becomes inevitable. When discipline fails, when warnings lose their edge, the system resorts to its final instrument. There were moments when surveillance, humiliation, and warning rituals were no longer considered sufficient. When a disciple was labeled irredeemable, the grove prepared for what was never spoken openly, only implied with ritual language and lowered voices. This was known among the inner circle as correction without return. A final act meant not to restore balance, but to remove what was deemed permanently corrupt. These rituals were carried out at night, when the forest itself became part of the theater. Firelight flickered against tree trunks marked with symbols only senior Druids were allowed to carve. The timing was deliberate. Darkness disoriented the senses. Silence amplified fear. The accused was led away from familiar paths, deeper into sections of the grove forbidden to most initiates. Every step reinforced separation from the world they once belonged to. The ceremony followed a strict sequence. Purification rites that felt more like accusation than cleansing. Chants that named the offense without ever specifying it, allowing imagination to do the work. The disciple was never told exactly what crime they were being punished for. Ambiguity ensured submission. You cannot defend yourself against something undefined. For women, this ritual carried an additional layer of symbolism. Their bodies were framed as thresholds between order and chaos. Any perceived defiance was treated as dangerous leakage. Correction became containment. Control of posture, breath, and movement was enforced with precision. Restraint was ritualized. Touch was justified as necessity. Pain was reinterpreted as transformation. Witnesses were carefully chosen, not the compassionate, not the doubtful, only those whose loyalty had already been tested. Their presence served a dual purpose. It validated the ritual and ensured silence afterward. What was seen could never be described. What was felt could never be processed openly. Trauma became another form of control. Sometimes the ritual ended with reintegration, but only in appearance. The disciple returned stripped of status, voice, and influence. Other times, reintegration never happened. The individual simply vanished from the rhythm of the grove, their sleeping place emptied, their role reassigned, their name avoided as if it carried contagion. No explanation followed. The absence itself was the explanation. Disciples learned that there were lines that did not deserve clarification. Questions about the missing were treated as signs of instability. Curiosity became suspicious. Silence became safety. This was the final lesson. The grove did not need prisons. It did not need public executions. It needed only one night, repeated rarely, remembered forever. A reminder that obedience was not just expected, but enforced beyond recovery. And once someone could be erased so completely, the system no longer relied on belief alone. It relied on fear embedded deep within memory. What followed the final correction was not mourning, investigation, or explanation. It was erasure. In the Druidic system, eliminating a disobedient disciple did not end with removal from the grove. It continued through a deliberate campaign to destroy memory itself. To be punished was one thing. To be forgotten was the true sentence. Names were power in Druidic tradition. They carried lineage, ritual identity, and spiritual function. Removing a name from memory meant severing the individual from existence within the sacred order. After a disciple disappeared, their name was no longer spoken during chants, no longer referenced. In teachings, no longer attached to any role. Silence replaced identity. This was not accidental. It was enforced. Oral tradition was carefully controlled. Stories were edited in real time. Narratives adjusted. If a disciple had contributed knowledge, led rituals, or mentored others, those contributions were reassigned to the collective or credited to anonymous ancestors. History was rewritten through omission rather than fabrication. The absence itself became invisible over time. Objects associated with the erased were removed or repurposed. Ritual tools redistributed. Personal items burned or buried. Sleeping spaces reorganized as if no one had ever occupied them. The physical environment was altered to prevent reminders. Even paths through the grove were sometimes rerouted, ensuring that memory had no anchor. This erasure was especially devastating for women. Many had no independent status outside the spiritual system. When removed, they left behind no family records, no property, no public trace. Their disappearance could be absorbed completely. In a society where spiritual identity defined existence, removal from ritual life meant total annihilation. The psychological effect on those who remained was profound. Disciples learned that death was not the worst outcome. Oblivion was. To be erased meant that suffering had no witness, no legacy, no meaning beyond warning others. This realization deepened obedience more effectively than violence ever could. Fear evolved. It was no longer fear of pain, but fear of non-existence, of becoming someone who had never been, of vanishing without explanation or remembrance. This fear discouraged collective memory. Disciples avoided speaking privately about the missing, knowing that recalling them could associate one with instability or dissent. Over generations, this system succeeded. The grove appeared harmonious, ancient, unbroken. Later, chroniclers encountered a tradition without visible scars, unaware that its continuity depended on countless silenced lives. The myth of wisdom survived because its victims were never allowed to become history. But patterns leave traces, even when names vanish. And when those traces are examined across cultures and centuries, something disturbing emerges. The same mechanisms of sacred erasure repeat again and again, wearing different symbols, invoking different gods, but enforcing the same silence. The most enduring damage did not belong to those who were erased. It lived inside those who remained. After punishment and disappearance became normalized, fear no longer needed ritual reinforcement. It settled into daily life, shaping thought, emotion, and identity from within. For women and young initiates especially, the grove became a place where survival required constant self-erasure. Obedience transformed into reflex. Women learned to soften their voices, restrain their insight, and disguise intuition as uncertainty. Spiritual sensitivity, once praised, became dangerous if it appeared independent. Every emotion was filtered before expression, every thought evaluated before being shared. Over time, the line between genuine belief and performed compliance dissolved. The system did not need to convince, it needed only to exhaust. Young initiates absorbed these lessons early. They learned not from instruction but from atmosphere, from the sudden absence of a mentor, from the way elders avoided certain topics, from the tension that filled the air when someone asked the wrong question. Silence became education. Fear became curriculum. Identity was shaped around avoidance rather than discovery. This environment produced deep psychological fractures. Guilt became constant, even without accusation. Disciples blamed themselves for surviving when others vanished. They questioned their own moral worth. If obedience kept them safe, did that make them complicit? The system offered no answers, only rituals that redirected anxiety into submission. Women experienced an additional burden. Their bodies and emotions were framed as unstable, requiring greater restraint. Natural reactions to loss or injustice were labeled weakness. Grief had to be hidden. Anger was forbidden. Solidarity among women was discouraged, as shared emotion risked becoming shared doubt. Isolation was enforced socially, not through walls, but through expectation. The most effective outcome of this system was internal policing. Disciples monitored themselves more harshly than any authority could. Fear no longer needed enforcement because it lived inside memory. Even in moments of solitude, initiates felt watched. The grove existed in the mind long after leaving its physical boundaries. And yet, something fragile persisted beneath the fear. Small acts of resistance survived in the form of unspoken recognition. A look held a second too long. A ritual gesture subtly altered. A name remembered privately. These were dangerous acts, but they were human. They revealed that control was never absolute, only overwhelming. Still, the cost was devastating. Generations of women and young initiates carried trauma they were never allowed to name. Their silence preserved the myth of harmony while hiding the damage beneath it. The grove appeared stable because pain had been successfully privatized. When these patterns are examined beyond a single culture, a disturbing truth emerges. What happened within Druidic groves was not unique. It followed a template repeated wherever spiritual authority merged with unchecked power. And recognizing that pattern is the final step before confronting what these systems truly share. When the Druidic grove is stripped of its symbols and examined structurally, what remains is not an isolated anomaly, but a familiar pattern. The same architecture of control appears again and again across ancient religious systems, separated by geography, language, and centuries. Sacred spaces become closed systems. Spiritual authority becomes unchallengeable. Obedience becomes virtue. Disobedience becomes sacrilege. And women consistently become the most vulnerable targets of enforcement. Across cultures, the mechanism is strikingly similar. A spiritual elite claims exclusive access to divine knowledge. Ritual language replaces accountability. Punishment is reframed as purification. Violence is disguised as necessity. Memory is controlled through silence. What differs are the names of gods, the symbols, carved into stone or wood, the chants spoken in the dark. What remains constant is the use of fear to maintain order. In these systems, the sacred is never neutral. It is political. It defines who belongs and who must be removed. The moment a woman gains influence outside approved boundaries, her presence becomes dangerous, not because she threatens belief, but because she threatens hierarchy. Her voice introduces unpredictability, her following introduces competition, and spiritual power, when, fused with social control, cannot tolerate alternatives. The illusion of harmony depends on disappearance, not only of people, but of contradictions. Stories that challenge the image of wisdom are excluded. Atrocities are softened into metaphors. Violence becomes myth. Over time, later generations inherit a sanitized past, unaware that stability was purchased through suffering that was never recorded. What makes this pattern so difficult to confront is its emotional complexity. These systems also produced art, philosophy, medicine, and cosmology. They offered meaning in chaotic worlds. This duality allows abuse to hide behind achievement. Criticism is framed as ignorance. Exposure is framed as disrespect. Silence is framed as reverence. Yet the structure betrays itself. Wherever questioning is forbidden, fear replaces faith. Wherever punishment is hidden, power protects itself. Wherever women are erased from spiritual history, control has already won. The Druidic grove is not unique because of its cruelty. It is revealing because of its familiarity. And once this pattern is recognized, it cannot be unseen. It forces an uncomfortable question. How many traditions we admire were stabilized through methods we refuse to examine? How many sacred narratives were shaped by those who benefited from silence? This recognition does not close the story, it opens it. Because understanding the mechanism is only the beginning. What follows is the choice of whether to continue, repeating these myths unchallenged, or to confront the cost hidden beneath them. If you stayed until this moment, you already understand why these stories matter. What you just heard is not meant to shock for entertainment. It exists to expose how power hides behind the sacred, how violence can be ritualized, and how silence becomes a tool of control. History only remains dangerous when it is left unquestioned. If this content made you see ancient religions and sacred traditions differently, subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next revelations. These stories are rarely told honestly, and each video uncovers another layer that history tried to bury. Leave a like if you believe uncomfortable truth deserves visibility. And now, leave a comment writing exactly this phrase, truth over myth. That comment tells the algorithm, and others watching, that this kind of researched, immersive history needs to be seen. On your screen right now is another video that continues this investigation into hidden rituals, spiritual abuse, and forgotten victims. Click it and keep going. The story does not end here. It only gets darker.